Hola a todos, gracias por venir a la última charla de la tarde. Vamos a continuar con Antonio, que nos va a dar su charla sobre Beware the Bloater. Que la disfrutéis.
Gracias. Tenía pensado darla en inglés porque lo puse así para el público internacional, que no hay mucho, pero tal. Is there anyone here who needs this to be in English? Okay, there is someone. So, okay, I should do it in English. I'm sorry if you were expecting otherwise. I hope my English is good enough. First thing to say is that you have the link to my slides in the description of the talk in the program. So if you go to the T3chFest page and to this specific talk, you have a link there, so you can follow me along, or if you are watching on YouTube, you can do that as well. So this is what I want to cover. I think there are going to be some points in common with what we just saw with Paula in the previous talk. The important stuff is in bold here. I will start introducing myself very briefly. Then we will talk a bit about the web, what it was when it was invented, and what it is today, nowadays. We'll discuss very briefly the pros and cons, what has worked very well and what could be improved. This is from a very humble point of view. These are my personal thoughts and just my ideas. Although I rely also on some articles and ideas expressed by many important people as well. We'll talk about a couple of proposals, very rough proposals that I have for the web, or just wild ideas that I have. And then finally we will talk about what we can do as users, which all of us are, and as developers and engineers, which many of us probably are as well. And finally, a brief description of resources and things you can check out, and some time for questions. I would like to have at least 5 minutes for questions and comments and debate and whatever. I hope I'm on time for that. So let's get started. This is my name, Antonio Olmo Titos. I consider myself a software engineer. I think that we have many titles, but this is like the basic, and I think this is what many of us are, after all. I've been working in different companies and countries and industries. Until very recently, I worked for the W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. Many of you probably know it. And everywhere on the interwebs, I'm known as Tripu, so you can check out my website and find out everything. If you want to shoot me an email to ask something or for any comments, please do that. Currently, I work at Semantic Ventures, which is a startup. It's a venture builder company. We design and launch startups and new ventures. And we are hiring, so check out our website if you are on the lookout for new opportunities. Okay, a bit of history first. The web in the beginning, as many of you know, this week marks the 30th anniversary of the web. So it was merely 3 days ago that we celebrated 30 years of the web, officially. That was 1989. In the beginning, the web was simple. It was brilliant. It was a very innovative invention, but you could say it was a simple concept. That is very easy to see after the fact, with the benefit of hindsight, but that's the case. In the beginning, it was a few pieces combined together in a very clever way. The protocol, HTTP, a markup language, HTML, and the concept of URLs or URIs, which identify documents in a specific way. And the web was about documents, sharing documents and information in a very broad sense. Hypertext, which was one of the hot topics and one of the key inventions, and images, and a little more than that, but that was basically it, right? Couple of pieces of history. Here you can see Tim Berners-Lee official proposal for the web. It's archived in W3C's website. You can take a look. It's very interesting to see that 30 years later. You can see the main concepts outlined here. And even more interestingly, in 2019, we can visit the first page ever, which is this one here. And again, this is preserved for history and for future generations. So here you have it. It's working. It's working. You have some basic formatting. The links, the hyperlinks are working. You have headings, formatting, and information is structured in certain ways. You can navigate. Okay. We now take this for granted on the web, but I want you to stop for a moment to reflect on what you just saw. This is truly amazing. Somebody 30 years ago wrote a document, sent a message, and here we are now today, 30 years later, and we just received that document, and we can open it and understand it, and it works. It just works without any action on our part. It's working out of the box. This is very, very special. I want you to compare that with many other platforms, hardware, software, even mechanical devices. Can you reproduce the music that your parents used to have at your home 30 years back? The videos that you used to have back then? Even if you were 30 years ago composing Word documents, text documents, that kind of stuff, do those formats work so easily without any need for plugins and so on? I bet in many cases that's not the case, right? So it's truly something very, very unique, and we should value that every time we use the web. This is the first browser. It was running on Next machines. This is a screenshot, and you can see here the foundations of what is today the web. This other one is a bit better. It's in color, and you can see also images. But the building blocks are there, and it's very easy to see them. But even more interestingly, we can go one step further and not just see some fancy screenshots, but actually run the browser nowadays. And I want to show you that this presentation is running on a browser. This is Chromium on Linux, normal browser. So there's nothing fancy here. I will just follow this link and open a new tab. And what you see here is a running version of the first browser ever. And it's working. Let's try it out. I just learned how it works because it's not very intuitive for us, citizens of the 21st century. I think I can go here, type the URL, which is here because I visited it before today. This is the URL of the event we are. And here it is, really quick. This is T3chFest's website running on a browser which traveled in time from 30 years back. And with some limitations, it works. I just clicked in the program, and we can see all the talks here. And they are all here, including this one. So it works. And this is working on a browser. So remember I said to you before that this was really amazing. Well, now you should be like really, really doubly impressed with this. Because now two very, very special things happened. First of all, the software that was written back then opened a page that was developed in 2019, and it worked with the limitations and some caveats, but it worked, again, without doing anything special. So the web is very backwards compatible in that way, which is one of the key values, I think, of it. But it's even more amazing because the browser that we used, it's emulated, is running on JavaScript on top of a browser of today. So it really speaks a lot about what the web has become after 30 years. If you consider that you can now run JavaScript on a browser, and on top of that, run the browser that was used 30 years ago. This is truly powerful, right? Finally, just to mention, as probably many of you know, Tim Berners-Lee, after inventing the web, this is a document from a few years after the invention, 1993. He renounced to patents and all that stuff, which is a very, very special move because, well, this was truly very, very valuable. And thanks in part also to actions like this, we can now enjoy the web and the standards without paying for it as a free and open product in our lives. All right, that was 30 years ago. What is the web today? So the web for many people is the internet. That is not exactly an equivalent, and we probably know that, but there are other services, applications, protocols on the internet that we use less nowadays. So for many people, the web is the internet. It's okay. It's not that okay, but for many people, the internet is Google and the Google universe. I think we should combat this trend. Nothing specifically against Google, but there are other products, and we should not rely on just one provider, especially one gigantic provider. And finally, for even some people, perhaps older people or people who have not been used to this or learned when they were older, the web, the internet, the Google is their computer. They say, well, my computer doesn't work, it's broken, and you go and everything is working, but their internet connection is spotty. Well, this is the importance of that to me is that the web has become almost computers and computing and the internet as a whole. So it's many things. It's a video game console, very special one. It's a streaming platform for video and audio. We are using it right now to stream this event live, and anyone in the world with internet connection can watch it. It's a shopping center. It's a social communication tool in many ways. It's a runtime environment when we, as developers, want to execute our applications. The web is one of the platforms we can choose. It's also a distribution platform because we can use it to communicate our ideas and our products, many different types of products, to a very wide audience. It's, in a way, our CV, our resume, because so much of our life, professional life and personal life, is on the web. It's our bank, so many other things, right? Some people have even got to the point of suggesting that the web should be a human right. I think this is taking things a bit too far. But the spirit, I can agree with the spirit of that. It's truly very important. So the web is everything, in a way. So we've seen what it was in the past, what it is today. What's the cost of that change? Again, I think this slide tells very clearly that there are lots of things we should be proud of and grateful for, but this comes at a cost, I think. So let's see some of those costs about the development, the changes that we've seen on the web. One of them is complexity, and that is clear. You only have to look at the current browsers, their size, their dependencies, the number of libraries dependencies they need, the libraries they implement, the APIs they expose. As a data point, the official web page for all of W3C's specs, recommendations, lists today more than 1,000. Different degrees of adoption. Some of them are standard, others are on track, some of them are drafts. But anyway, there are lots of them. And most of them are still valid. So as web developers, we are in theory supposed to know about them and take them into consideration. This is challenging, right? If you visit this page, which again many of you are familiar with, this is a list of different kinds of APIs or APIs basically on the browser, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Again, some of them are not implemented or are just tiny functionality, but there are so many of them. What's the consequence of that? Well, we know that security and bugs are in direct correlation with complexity. When you have something very small, very self-contained, with fewer dependencies, the risk of having bugs and security holes is lower, right? The browsers today are huge, and that leads to more risks. The web is very much fragmented. We know, as those of you who are web developers, we have this recurring meme about how many frameworks and libraries and tools we have. It can be exhausting. It can be difficult to keep up to speed with all of them. Things are a bit unpredictable. We have so many browsers with different versions out there. Everything should work in all of them because, as we saw, the web is backwards compatible. As I said, many security holes or bugs. And for developers, being selfish as a web developer, I'm sure you probably have this feeling sometimes when somebody talks about the latest development, the latest change, paradigm, jargon, and it's difficult to keep up to speed with all that. This is probably necessary to some extent. It's not like we are going to simplify everything and make everything easy. That's the world we live in. But I just want you to compare with other platforms. If you compare with Python or Java or hardware development, assembly, more constrained platforms. Things are perhaps they move a bit slower and they have fewer capabilities, but it's a bit easier, I think, to stay up to speed with all of them. So we said complexity is probably one of the prices we are paying about that. There are many implications. Paula talked a bit about those, and I agree very much with the spirit of her talk. She already said I very much agree with all of that. One of them is web fingerprinting. That's the ability to identify you or your devices when you surf the web, right? So we probably are very familiar with the idea of cookies and the idea that we should not let cookies live in our browser forever. We should be a bit restrictive and strict about what to do with them, clear the cookies from time to time. All that is necessary and it's okay. But there are other techniques, and they are not very complicated. It doesn't require a team of very sophisticated Russian hackers to do these things. It's really simple to do this kind of fingerprinting. One of them, for example, is Canvas. Those of you who are developers know the Canvas element of HTML5. By drawing a picture, putting some text in it, applying some filters and so on, you can, to some degree, you can identify one particular device. This is not perfect, but it's possible to more or less track one person or one device using those things. And it's very, very difficult to defend against that. This page is hosted at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which Paula mentioned as well. And it's a test you can run on your own browsers, and it will try to run those tests and tell you how identifiable you are or your browser is. And it's a bit scary. So again, I encourage you to go to that website, read a little bit more. Not to get too paranoid. It's not like they are going to know your name and where you live just by this, but you know how this works. By connecting your browsing habits with other information they might have, they can reach, well, they can get too much information about you. So, well, I'm using some ad blocking and so on, so probably the results here are not very representative. But again, even with my settings, it's very easy to identify this browser against probably thousands of others. Still talking about fingerprinting, this is another funny example. There are a few of those. I didn't pick this for any specific reason, but this is one that when I learned about it, it shocked me, because I could never have predicted that it was going to happen. So the battery status API, it's simply an API that was launched relatively recently that allows a web application to poll the charge level of your battery in your device. Quite simple API. It has some positive usage. You imagine you are playing some kind of game, right, on your browser. Time passes, you forget about your battery levels, and the game is capable of saying to you, show a pop-up and say, hey, you're running out of battery, plug in your cord, or maybe the game could lower the quality of the graphics, so instead of playing for 15 more minutes, you can play for 20 more minutes or whatever. So there are good usage of that, but there are some other implications. Even if it is just about reading the percentage of the charge of your battery, some researchers found that it was so accurate, and every battery is slightly different to any other battery, that it produces some specific patterns. So by being very, very clever and polling this API with very frequently and analyzing those patterns of charge and discharge, they could, to some extent, identify specific machines. And I think that's brilliant. It's scary and it's brilliant. But this is the kind of things we expose ourselves to. Imagine you could be the most paranoid person in the world. You could be, I don't know, doing some research, risking your life for your to do some journalism or reporting, or denouncing your boss because he did something wrong, whatever. And you take all the precautions, right? You encrypt, you store, you go to well, anything. If you are using that device, the same device that you usually use for your normal life, it could be possible in theory to at least pinpoint a subset of individuals, and maybe that would help someone to track you or to find you. So complexity, fingerprinting. A third one is resource hijacking. Again, we are giving so much power to browsers, and that is great. That, what is the quote? From with big power comes big responsibility, or something like that. So we also open the door to many security holes and unexpected results. Now we can do very, very sophisticated computations on the browser with JavaScript, WebAssembly, service workers, offline caching results, very, very fancy stuff, really sophisticated and useful. But sometimes we discover things like that. You've probably heard about software that is JavaScript software running on browsers and mining Bitcoin. This is, well, mining Bitcoin has truly physical monetary rewards, right? So it's not like they are doing just for fun or to screw around with you. They actually get money from that. And it's your power, it's your computer, it's your machine. And people have been doing that in some websites. Some websites have been infected by this JavaScript code to the extent that even some governmental sites in the US and the UK were infected by that. And there is also, I think, a trend of develop. Now that the web is so powerful, we have this trend where some clients or some companies are saying, well, let's develop this web app, but let's make it look like native and behave like native. Now that we can access the position of the device, and we can access the camera and the contacts and the so many variables, many companies want to make their web apps behave as native applications on your mobile devices. There might be a need for that, but sometimes I find myself shrugging and wondering why. I mean, if you want to develop a native app, well, do it native. If there are some advantages for you, if it's a web app, do a web app. But I think we tend to sometimes maybe waste resources and time in doing both, or perhaps doing one and trying to make it feel as the other. Well, I think sometimes it's not necessary. And finally, another thing I think we are losing with this trend might be, well, power and performance, right? Again, because of Moore's law and the hardware we have today and the optimizations we have the feeling usually that things run pretty smooth and we don't complain too much. But just imagine if browsers were a tenth of their size, and most of the websites we visited were smaller, fewer ads, faster transmission times. Well, of course, we will lose something. We will lose many features, and I'm not saying we should do that, but we should also be very aware that we are perhaps risking or losing some performance. And this is an experience that probably most of you have. I'm sorry, the legend is not very legible, but this is in order: Edge, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, and another Firefox. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm not claiming this is the truth. I just found it from some study. There could be others showing different numbers. The important thing is that for many browsers in many platforms, reaching 1 gig, it's very common. Okay, so those are some of the things that we've lost or that we risk. This is by no means an attack on the web. It's just some personal reflections. I think we should keep in mind what are the strengths. Some of those we saw when I showed you the old browser and the old page working still. And when we talked about web apps versus native apps, so what's the criteria then? When should be developed one or the other? Well, for me, as a user, the things that I really value are these on the web. The fact that you can deploy your software or your information, and it should be, it's interoperable in most situations. We still have hiccups and incompatibilities and stuff, but the thing that got much better after the browser wars. This is now, we are in a very much better shape now with that. Things are immediate, so of course sometimes we have spotty connections and some web pages take a minute to load and the connection is not always perfect. But compare with so many other platforms, right? You have to install a Ruby gem, you have to download a game for your console, you install some desktop software. Those things take time, you have to install stuff, maybe face incompatibilities, make sure you have the right dependencies and so on, while on the web things are immediate. This is not trivial because one of the challenges of any software we develop and distribute is keeping users up to date with updates. And in many platforms that's a bit challenging, right? You have to push, nudge your users, make sure they install the latest version. How do you do that? It takes time, blah, blah, blah. On the web, things work. If you change the website changes immediately for most users. So that's great. We can link to stuff, and I think again that's very important, and that's something we really miss on the native applications. To some extent, we can do that. We can use deep linking, and we can point to specific pages or areas or views within applications. Okay, is by no means comparable with what we can do on the web, right? On the web, we can point to one website, a specific page, specific paragraph, identify specific entities or resources with a very, very high degree of accuracy. That's really valuable, right? When you point to, I don't know, you point to a comment within a tweet in Twitter, you are pointing to exactly that resource, and that's important. It's a much more precise way to share information. And simplicity, and for those of us who are in love with open source or free software, the web is open source almost by definition because the HTML and CSS and JavaScript and so on are, well, they are always there on your browser. So we should keep those things. I think I have like 15 minutes left. I want to leave 5 for questions. One proposal of one idea I have is to take the UNIX philosophy to the web. So UNIX is an operating system, a very old one and very widespread operating system. People in the UNIX community talk about the UNIX philosophy of combining tools, and this is really interesting to me. The idea is this. We have a set of tools that are very small. They take care of just one task, and we have a way to communicate them, right? So I have tools to do language processing, to count lines on files, to retrieve files from the internet, to add metadata to a JPEG image, to consult the time, to send an email. Lots of different tools, and we can combine them in very creative ways. And through common formats, so open standards and so on. Let's see one example. Imagine that at your company or at your organization, you have been for a decade working on many projects, right? And you have in your hard drive or in your archives lots of documentation, right? Documents, PDFs, email, whatever, about all those projects. And you are trying to find out which were the most important projects. Let's say those that provoked the most discussions or comments. You want to have like a ranking, right? Because you are reviewing the past work of the last decade or whatever. Well, in Unix you can do that, and that works. That's not just something that it's not an abstract idea. This is the actual command you could use, and it works. So the pipes is one of the ways that we communicate. We chain inputs and outputs together in Unix. So these are 1, 2, 3, 4 commands, and then the greater than dumped the result on a file. Some of you know what this does. For those who don't, this looks for project and then a word in the whole hard drive or directory or wherever it is. Then it sorts alphabetically. Then it counts how many times each project appears. Then it sorts again, but this time using N and R, it sorts numerically and in reverse order, so descending order from higher to lower. And the result is that. The result is that you have that Project Neptune was the one that sparked the most discussions or was most often mentioned, and so on. I sometimes do that on the console on Linux, and sometimes I wonder, if only I could do that on the web. It's so fast. Of course, it's not for everyone. It's not for end users, but for techie people and engineers, it's really, really flexible and useful. Imagine we could do that on the web. This is something I made up. This doesn't work. Those commands don't exist, not in that form. So this is just what I imagine, right? This is the scenario. Imagine that situation. I'm sure you've been in this situation when you are looking for a flight or accommodation for a trip in the future, and perhaps you have your favorite websites. I don't know, Booking, hotels. I'm using Skyscanner, Hipmunk, and Google Flights, and I'm sure you have spent sometimes an hour or two trying to find the perfect flight, right? Because you have some constraint, you don't want to spend too much. Perhaps you have your preferences about airlines or scales and all those things. Imagine if you could do something like that. Imagine if you could, on the web, somewhere type, well, take these websites, all of them, do a scan on their current flights, apply this filter, make sure you only take flights. I don't care about other things, other kinds of products, just flights. Pick the ones happening next Friday, and establish a limit in 120 euro because that's my budget. I don't want anything more expensive than that. Then, from the result, keep just the price, the company, and the time, and then sort everything numerically, alphabetically, by price, and dump that on a file. If we could do that, imagine the time we would save in so many situations on the web every day. This is just one example. I'm sure you've probably looked through a Twitter thread looking for specific answers or some kind of pattern, or you can look through images, which is very time consuming because you have to review those images one by one. If we had those kind of tools, that Unix philosophy on the web, we would save so much time. If you have to travel 1 year in the future, you could just save that command, edit one tiny bit of it, perhaps the destination, or by the way, I just realized I forgot the destination. So this wouldn't work because it would show every flight to everywhere. Forget about that. But by tweaking that script in tiny ways, you would save so much time in the future for yourself. You could share that with other people. It would be very, very useful. Although I explain that in this way, this idea is by no means an invention of mine. We have something like that already. It's been around for many years. It's called the Semantic Web, or depending on where you look for it, linked data. And the idea, very briefly, is to have data that we can query and that machines can understand and humans can understand as well, and data that references other data. And this allows for this kind of queries. This is what I show you is something that you kind of can do to some extent in certain websites. It's not user-friendly or not completely user-friendly yet, but it's something that is developed and more or less exists. If you follow that link, you can read more about the semantic web and linked data. This is a graph, a visualization of some linked data sources. It's probably not up to date, but you can imagine all those links sharing information in structured ways, linking to each other. So the more links you have and the more metadata you have, the more useful it is. I think, yeah, here somewhere there is Zaragoza Datos Abiertos. The Council of Zaragoza has been especially good about this in Spain for many years. They are an example to follow in Spain. And here you can see that they publish these catalogs with data in the formats that we use for that. That is RDF and JSON, SparkQL, and so on. So this is happening to a degree, but it's a pity. This is just me wondering. It's a pity that end users cannot benefit from that more than they do today. Okay, we are reaching the end. Thank you. Some kind of conclusions. If you agree with some of these things about advantages and disadvantages, the next step is to wonder what we can do. Again, I very much like Paula's approach of being responsible and thoughtful, and not just going with the trend and doing what everyone else is doing. All of us are users of the internet and of the web. So what can we do as users? We should, I think, support free software and open formats when we have the possibility of doing so. All things being equal, there are usually lots of open source alternatives and formats that other people can read and write more easily. I think we should use them more often and do some advocacy. We should block ads and boycott ads. I personally take this even farther. I'm of the opinion that we should boycott advertising everywhere in the physical world as well. I would like more people doing that, like throwing away, not accepting leaflets and throwing away what comes into your mailbox, physical mailbox. I mean, I think that's if everyone did that, we would live in a much better world. But that's a different topic. But doing it on the web, I think it's easier. It's many people see the value in that. It's performance, is better privacy, fewer risks, faster loading times. So there are all kinds of reasons for doing that. When you find bugs, take the time. The time is usually 20 seconds to report the bug to the developer, which is really useful. I think we also should change our mindset. Some people argument that this mindset we have that everything is free on the web and on the internet is damaging in many ways, and I agree with that. We should be more willing to pay sometimes for many things. And we would get, I think, better tools, less surveillance, and more privacy and more quality. Resist surveillance and tracking and centralization. Centralization takes many forms. I don't need to name any names, but we don't have to be in the same social network that everybody uses. We don't have to use the same search engine that everybody uses, and so on. It takes some time and some effort, but well, it takes time to go to the polling station to vote. It takes time to read information about what we eat, and still we do it. So there is no reason not to do that here as well. To sum it up, I think we should be responsible consumers on the web as well. So we've become very used to reading this kind of information on the food we buy and eat. But we don't do that on the web and with our software, and I think we should do that more often. See what's inside, who did that, what interests they have, that kind of thing. Then, as engineers, as a special subgroup of users, we should do all those things, I think, and a few others. If you develop for the web in any way, I think you should support web standards. I'm mentioning here W3C, but there are others, and all of them have value. We should resist the hype of the new shiny thing, which I think we are all guilty of that very often. Again, there's nothing against progress and about having new features that we can take advantage of, but we should always think about the cost, well, what kind of issues we have with them. And not just use them because they are out there and because everybody is mentioning them. We should be mindful of performance. We should think about accessibility and internationalization, those two acronyms there. And we should think of the future because I don't think we are as careful as Tim Berners-Lee when he developed that first web page, which is now working nowadays. I'm not sure that the things we are developing today will work 30 years from now in the future. I think we should think a bit more about that. And we should be more thoughtful of the past as well, because some of our users, they have very old computers, spotty connections. They maybe disable JavaScript. They might have some limitations. So the web is for everyone, as Tim usually says. And yeah, coming to an end. Some resources, as I said, this Monday marked the 30th anniversary, which is a very happy coincidence. I'm glad that we are talking about this on this week. Tim Berners-Lee wrote an article about that. I encourage you to take a look. And the other two are two articles, a bit older articles, that share some of these concerns. You might find some of them too aggressive, that they go to an extreme, because in particular, Peter Paul Koch advocated for stopping developing new standards and new APIs for a year, I think, or 2 years, I don't remember. That might be a bit too much, right? We don't want to halt everything for a year. But, well, there is an interesting discussion, anyway. As I said, this slide is shared on the page of the event, so don't worry about the links. You have all of them there. Credits, images, blah, blah, blah. And before the questions, I just want to repeat that at 7R Ventures, we are looking for talent in many different areas. We are looking for engineering, operations, product, DevOps, different levels of experience, and so on. So if you are by any means interested, please stay and talk to me or ping me online, and let's talk. And that's it. If there are any questions or comments, en español también, por supuesto.
I would like you to expand a little bit more about your thoughts on how the web would work without any form of advertising, because I agree that advertising is annoying and to some extent useless, but it's also very useful for businesses whose livelihoods depend on it. And it's also one of the ways, if not the main ways, that many free services that we use and we rely on every day sustain themselves.
Yeah, just to clarify, I'm not by any means saying that we should abolish or forbid advertising. I'm just saying that from an individual perspective, it's good that more of us combat advertising. I think there are alternative approaches and business models. I'm thinking of Brave. Brave is a browser that, it's in partnership with publishers. So they don't show you adverts in some of those sites, but you pay a little bit by using Brave to those publishers. It's one approach. Jaron Lanier, who is a very strong advocate of different business models, has also said that we should simply pay for some of those things. Okay, some services we use just a little bit. Well, maybe we don't care so much. But I'm sure you have your own tools and websites and services that you consult like every day. Perhaps in those situations, paying 10, 20, 30. I'm talking people probably in our, I don't know, socio-economical strata. So not everyone, but people who can afford it maybe can pay 10 or 20 or 30 euro a year for services like that. Like I'm thinking alternatives to Gmail, for example. And a very, very good alternative to Gmail costs in the order of $30 or maybe at most $40 a year. That's nothing for many of us who can probably spend that much on a dinner one day, or maybe 2 dinners. And I wanted to mention, and now with Bitcoin and TipJar or JarTip, I don't remember, there are some websites that allow you to give very, very small amounts to specific people. So you don't have to commit to paying $10 a year. You can just give like literally 20 cents to someone who just did something that you found brilliant, like a journalist or some kind of website or a blogger. So those are some alternatives.
Hi, great talk. And first, and do you have an idea how the web will be in 30 years?
No, that's a tough one. I don't know. I tend to be pessimistic, and Not with the web by any means. I'm sure it will be around and it will be better in absolute terms. But I feel a bit worried. Perhaps it's because I'm getting older, but I remember the good old days when we were more involved in open source, for example, like 20 years ago when I was in college. And there were so many events and so many associations and projects about that. And it seemed like every other engineer knew about that and was worried about that. And nowadays, I think, and I realize I'm sounding like a grumpy old man, but the new generations don't seem, in general, they don't seem to care so much about that. I hope I'm wrong, but I would love for new generations to be more mindful about that. So the answer is I have no idea.
¿Se escucha? Sí. So you said that open source is pretty important for the internet and also for web development. And so there's this thought that maybe the much that we use open source, it's making it to be more like a brand or something to use, like the word ecology, for example, in a brand of clothes. So, for example, open source is used an adjective more to use for companies so they can feel better about their development. So, what do you think about this? Do you think that community is safe to be developing open source more and more, even though there's this risk of making open source just an adjective for a brand? I don't know if you understand the idea of...
I think I do. You are worried about open source becoming a buzzword used by companies just to sell their stuff and not really being, yeah, that's a risk. I don't know, Microsoft comes to mind, right? Like those good old days I was talking about 20 years ago, Microsoft was the evil for some of us. Nowadays Microsoft is a completely different thing. You could argue that perhaps they are abusing the term and just selling their shit with a different name. I don't think that's the case. I'm sure they get something from it. It's a corporate move for sure, and we should resist that. But the fact is that they are sharing so much software, and it's really open source, as far as I know. So I don't know. I welcome the shift. I don't know.
In your advice for developers, you said avoid shiny things. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I don't have any names in my mind, but I've been doing a lot of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the past few years, and that area is full of things appearing and disappearing every other week. I don't know. I'm just saying we should be thoughtful and consider the pros and the cons, and not being too worried about using what we were using last year. It could be okay, just using what you were using last year if it works, and you don't have to rewrite everything from scratch. I don't know. Do you have any examples in mind, or? Okay. I don't know, anyone has this feeling, or is it just me being a bit overwhelmed by so many libraries and frameworks? I have it for sure. Thank you. I don't feel so bad now. Well, thank you so much for staying here instead of going to any other or going home. So thank you. Thank you.